Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I am Kristin McCarthy, the Director of Grants and Operations here at the Foundation, and I also author our weekly report on settlements and annexation. Today is February 8th, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ziv Stahl, the Executive Director of Yesh Din, which is an Israeli NGO that monitors settlement activity and related trends in the West Bank. Go to FMEP's website, FMEP.org, and the research page for this podcast to see Ziv's full and impressive bio. And any links to articles or reports that I mentioned will also be on that page. So Ziv, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I know we're delighted to have you back so soon. Also, bringing you back is probably not indicative of good news, but I know a couple weeks ago you spoke with my colleague Peter Beinart about specifically the new Israeli government's coalition agreements and what those agreements had to say about the plans of the new government for expanding its control over the West Bank, particularly with growing settlements and legalizing outposts and policies that amount to annexation. So I have you back today to kind of expand on that conversation with regards to settler violence, which is a key, it's an important long-term trend, but also something that that is very live and real right now. So thank you so much for being here. Yesh Din recently published a new report in which you've been tracking data on settler violence since 2005. So now we have that data updated to 2022. And we're going to get to that because I think that report and those numbers show really important long-term trends that are, go back way further than the current Israeli government, that show how systemic settler violence is and endemic it is. And it's an extremely important context for the conversation I want to have. The conversation that's really relevant today, which is, in the news recently, particularly in the past 2 weeks since the attack by a Palestinian on Israelis in the Neve Yaakov settlement that resulted in the death of 7. There's been so much talk about Palestinian violence, with Palestinian terrorists being, a lot of talk of terrorism, speculation about a new intifada, which always frames it as an uprising of Palestinian violence. And these are kind of the messages that, at least from my perch in the US, that we're hearing a lot right now. But there's been such comparatively little coverage of Israeli violence, and that's both state violence in the form of government policies, as well as and IDF actions and the violence of settlers, which is an important piece of how the occupation functions, I think. So that's what we're here to talk to you about today. It's definitely not a fun topic, but you and Yesh Din have, not only documented this and tracked it, but can unpack for us what it all means. So can we first start by talking about what you've seen over the past 2 weeks since that major terrorist attack on Neve Yaakov? What has happened in the West Bank since then?
So in terms of state violence, we've seen this before this specific attack. It is part of a bigger military operation named Breaking Waves, which means trying to handle terror groups and people who are involved in all sorts of activities. Basically, it means that the military raids homes and towns and sometimes arrests people, and a lot of times also injures and kills people. This is part of the incident, for example, where Shireen Abu Akleh was shot, where you see that they also hurt, in certain occasions, innocent stand-buyers and civilians, not just people who are actually involved in military actions. So this is one part which it goes on for, I think, a year or maybe even more in the West Bank, and that really increases the level of violence in the West Bank and I would say the weight of occupation that Palestinians feel in everyday life. And on the other hand, we see a spike in settler violence, which is also not new, and it's not a new thing that happened in the recent 2 weeks. But as we always see after attacks on Israelis, there's a spike in settler violence and kind of a retaliation acts by settlers towards Palestinians. Much more raids on villages, throwing stones on cities, and we've seen a spike of incidents this time too. So it's hard to single out, one incident and say this is because of that. It's kind of a chicken and an egg. You cannot say what starts what, but there is a rise in violence in general in the area.
Can you tell us, I mean, without going into too detailed specifically, what are the nature of the settler attacks on Palestinians? Are they everywhere across the West Bank? Like, where is kind of the hot spots or the friction points, as the IDF likes to call them? And what are the nature of them? I mean, what is the resulting damage?
So in terms of geography, it's all over the West Bank, but we do have what the army calls, as you said, friction areas, which is south of Hebron, the Shiloh Valley, the Itzhar, Nablus area. So you have certain places where you see it more often, and even there are more, I would say, you can expect violence there. And the fact that the army can say that doesn't suggest that they actually do something in those areas to prevent it. But I want to go back to the reasons for the settler violence, and I think that's really important to understand, because we talk about settler violence, for example, like in the recent 2 weeks, because of a spike that happened, maybe because of the terror attack. But the reasons are much deeper than that, and they're much more calculated than that. Because what we've seen on the ground is how settlers and by proxy the Israeli state is using settler violence in order to push Palestinians away from their lands and take over Palestinian land and expand, as a result, the Israeli control over Palestinian land in the West Bank. So this is the end game. This is why, and there's a lot of names to settler violence. We actually in Yesh Din, we like to call it ideologically motivated crimes, because the motivation is the ideology that Israel should control these areas and not Palestinians. And the motivation is to threaten them, to have them fear the settlers in order for them not to access their own lands, and then Israelis can take over. So I would say these are the main reasons.
Yeah, and I know Yesh Din a few years back published a really comprehensive report detailing how, why, what it looks like that settler violence is a tool for dispossession. And also, that the New York Times, actually, I always, quoting them is always a risk, but in a recent New York Times article, they quoted, this was so eye-catching to me, they quoted a 19-year-old settler who's been involved in establishing illegal outposts. And this is what he says, getting to your point about this is an ideological crime. It's not just a racist motivated. I mean, it is, but it's also more than that. There's a point to it. So this settler, whose name I didn't write down, but this is what he said. Quote, "It's a national war between two people. The conflict is over land. There is less and less land to claim. And so the war over that land will intensify." End quote. So that's kind of talking about the motivation behind this violence towards Palestinians. It's not just a matter.
The settlers themselves do not argue about that. A lot of people, look, when I get questions about this, some people say, well, there are hate crimes everywhere. And I try to explain it's not a normal hate crime as you describe it in other places. Israel has sometimes hate crimes. This is not the case here. Sometimes it is, as you said, race motivated or nationality motivated, or you can look at it as also a hate crime, but it's a certain kind of hate crime, and it has political aim. And this is really important to understand.
And it's extraordinarily effective, right? Like it's an extraordinarily effective way to take over de facto all of this land, because of course the IDF's in the West Bank to protect the settlers. And so the mechanisms of protection are land takeover. And I think I want to ask you to talk to our listeners and viewers about one specific village that was in the headlines recently because there was a settler attack. The settlers crept into Termessiah, this village in the northern West Bank, that's actually home to many Palestinian American citizens, like settlers snuck in and actually lit a house, a car on fire, and committed a lot of other crimes, property damage. And while that's not new, this village has been suffering from settler violence for a long time. It did catch a lot of headlines because I think it was one of the bigger attacks over the past 2 weeks. So can you talk to us about Messiah? I know Yesh Din's been incredibly involved there, both in documenting and trying to get some accountability for settler violence, but also in terms of land cases and helping these villagers keep their land. So paint a picture for us about this village and kind of the geography of it. I know that has quite the view of expanding settlements, and also what the villagers have suffered.
So this village is located in the Shiloh Valley. It's an area between Ramallah and Nablus. And actually, it is surrounded by settlements and outposts, illegal outposts. So far, they're illegal anyway, which means that there is a lot of struggle over the control of the land surrounding Messiah. Now, you have to understand maybe just a little bit of background on West Bank in general. So, you know, as a result of the Oslo Agreement, we have the division between areas A, B, and C. A is the towns and cities, the big cities such as Ramallah and Nablus. B is usually where the villages sit on, just the built area of the village. And then the land surrounding the village, the agricultural land of the village, is usually area C. You have some villages also in area C, but mostly the village itself sits on area B, especially in this area that we're talking about. And the surrounding land is area C. Now, area C is also where all the settlements and outposts are. And the main struggle over land in the West Bank currently is the struggle over the control on area C. Israel and a lot of the Israelis more and more sees area C as part of Israel. When we talk about annexation and the Caribbean annexation, we are talking about mainly what's going on area C and how Israel treats area C as part of bigger Israel or sovereign Israel. And more so, especially now with the new government that is taking us to full annexation of area C. So, but even before, as you said earlier, even before this new government, this calling annexation, the de facto annexation on the ground, I think Messiah is a very good case study to look at, because what we see there is the village Messiah and some neighboring villages as well are surrounded by the Shiloh and the Shvut Rachel settlements, but also many outposts such as Esh Kodesh and Adei Ad, Achia, Kida, and we have others, which are, I would say, violent outposts, neither in the past or right now, and very, very active in trying to take over more and more Palestinian land. And when you look at maps of this area, we see that a lot of the land that used to belongs to Palestinians now have either an outpost sits on the land or some ways of Israeli control of the land, especially using agriculture. So you have the big Achia farm, for example, that sits on some Palestinian land. You have others, and it's hard to do this in a podcast where you can only hear but not see. But if you look at maps of this area, and throughout the years, so you can see the development of these places. Now, when you maybe I will say something. I told you before before we started recording, I wrote my first report as a researcher in Yesh Din was on this area, and in this report we took aerial photos of this area for many years, and we examined the expansion of the outposts, and then we compared this with the locations of settler violence incidents. And what you can see is a complete match between the two. So in the beginning, when the outpost is small, you have the violent incidents very close to where the few caravans of the beginning of the outpost are. But then when they develop and grow, the settler violence gets also spread as kind of following the spread of the outpost. From that, you can conclude that this is how they expand. They use the violence that pushes the Palestinians out of the area, and then they take over the land, whether it's by building more houses or construction, or taking it with agricultural takeover. And this is a very, very good example in Turmusaya because they have a lot of olive trees, vineyards, and they used to have a lot of agriculture, which is seasonal in the area. They cannot no longer cultivate the land for seasonal crops because they have no access to the land. And also the olive trees, over the years, we in Yesh Din documented tens incidents of cutting off trees, and sometimes we are talking about hundreds of trees getting cut off at the same incident in one day. What we also see in this area is the involvement of the Israeli state. So all these outposts that are built illegally or so-called illegally around the village of Turmusaya also enjoy funds from the state and infrastructure, and of course protection by the army, but also the protection is achieved in restriction of Palestinian movement. So once there is a Jewish settlement near a village, now the farmers cannot enter their land freely. Usually it is restricted to twice a year for plowing and for harvesting season. Sometimes it's closed altogether if it's very close to the outpost. And this is all in the name of security. Another thing that is, I think, important to mention, maybe two things. One is that the obligation of the military is also to protect the Palestinian, not just the Israeli settlers. But most of the soldiers are not aware of this obligation, and they certainly did not follow it. Maybe we'll expand on that later on. And another point I want to stress is maybe the attention this attack on Turmusaya got from the media and from the public in the recent weeks. And this is only because it was well documented. There was a killing footage of the arson. Usually we have documented many cases like that, and we don't see so much attention. Sometimes, usually actually, it doesn't get any attention at all, not in Israel and not abroad. And maybe another word about like numbers. So Yesh Din documented in the recent years 56 cases of settler violence, whether damage to property or proper violence in the Turmusaya area, just Turmusaya, not the entire area. This is of course not the total number of incidents, that just the numbers of incidents that was reported to us. In 49 of the cases, the Palestinians went to the police and filed a complaint. You want to guess how many?
Israeli police, correct?
Israeli police.
There's no one else, yeah.
Yeah, you want to guess how many indictments? One. So out of all of these incidents, and we're talking about several years, only one indictment. And this is very rare that there are any indictments. So this is something, I guess we'll talk about it later on, but it's a good zoom in to look at one village and to understand what is the reality of living in such village exposed to so many attacks and settler violence, and basically have no answer from the Israeli authorities who are in charge of enforcing the law of protection.
Yeah, and for Turmusaya, which, you know, sits in this little valley and can see the outposts and the settlements growing and can watch the settlers descend down the hills and know they're coming to instigate violence, and what that violence looks like. It's not always bodily harm, but it's cutting down olive trees, it's damage to properties, slashing tires. As you said, it's the state violence of road closures and land confiscation and all of that. And I think the new report by Yesh Din categorizes these sort of things and looks at the types of different violence that's perpetrated. And I just hope that listeners can understand that this is, it's so all encompassing. It's not just one thing. It's a very multifaceted strategy of these settlers to terrorize their Palestinian neighbors in a pointed effort to take control of more land, right?
Yeah, so maybe just two more points. One is that actually we have a very good relationship with one of the residents of Turmusaya. His name is Mahmoud Al-Araj. He has a lot of agriculture, has a lot of agricultural land, we've been accompanying him to file complaints with the police and representing him for years now. We all have been to his house and know him and his family. And actually, this guy has a book of all the incidents, even before Yesh Din existed, of all the incidents that he reported to the police about of settler violence. And there is no indictment in any of them. And we are talking about tens of complaints during the years. This is one point. And I think, and from his house, like you can see from the window, as you said, the outposts are growing and his land is getting smaller and smaller and less access to his land. And actually he fears going to the land, because once he goes to the land, there can be encounters with the settlers and he can be attacked, which happened a few times to him and his family and other members of the village. So this is something to keep in mind. I think another one is, besides the assistance with filing complaints with the police, Yesh Din also tries to help the residents of Turunsaya to fight for the rights of the land. And one of the petitions we had to the High Court was together with other villages in the area, and it was demanding to evacuate the outpost of Adei Ad. And this was kind of an experiment petition for us, because on this case, we tried to argue not only that the construction is illegal and the outpost is illegal and it sits partly on private Palestinian land, but also that this outpost is a major source for settler violence and for human rights violations, and therefore needs to be evacuated. And of course, this has been going on for many years in the court. But basically, it led to the retroactive authorizations or efforts to retroactively authorize Adei Ad. And ever since, we also have now a new official settlement in the area, Amichai. And now Adei Ad and the neighboring outposts are going to be included in the big plan of Amichai. So even when you have Palestinians who actually try to believe in the Israeli authorities and address the Israeli court in order to get justice, they do not get justice. They get the kosher stamp on these illegal places, and basically a reward for settlers who break the law, who inflict violence to Palestinians.
Yeah, and I want to dig in on the accountability piece. And, you know, there could be books, and I'm sure there will be, and if not already, books written about the entire system in which Palestinians who are an occupied people have to file their criminal complaints with the Israeli police, and how that is in and of itself a system that is just absurd on the surface. And the more you dig into it, truly problematic, truly, I mean, there's even the hope of justice is far-fetched most times, because as we've seen, like even when there's video of crimes happening, the police will still raise their hands and say, we don't know who that was, or there's no witnesses. And so, you know, it's rare to the data on your new report, only 3% of crimes reported to Israeli police, hopefully I got that right, result in conviction. And that's from 2005 to 2022. I mean, yeah. This is a long sample of that. And that's only the crimes that are reported to police. Of course, as you said before, there's so many that aren't reported because, I mean, to do so takes a lot of effort. It takes, you know, willingness to engage with your oppressor and your occupying force, but that's the only place Palestinians have for any.
We actually document sometimes incidents where Palestinians are not willing to file complaints with the Israeli police, and we ask them why. And during the years, we've seen increase of the reluctance to file complaints with the Israeli police. And the reason that we mostly hear is that they have no reason to trust the Israeli police that it will do their jobs, and that they had a bad experience, them or their neighbors and friends and acquaintances. And we cannot argue with that, because they're right. They know the statistics as well as we do, that there is not a lot of chance that they will actually get justice. So why bother?
Just to reiterate, 3% result in conviction. But another stat that you have in this paper is that from this over the same period, you say 81.5% of cases, you have documented failure of the investigation police conduct. Talk to me about that. Like what's
okay, so
81
what
and a
Yesh
half
Din
percent?
does is we represent, legally represent victims of offenses, Palestinian victims of offenses. And we assist them with filing the police complaint itself, because as you said, it's not as accessible to them and not as easy. Then we document the police investigation, we monitor it. And when the file closes, which as you can see from our data, it's 93% of the cases, we get a copy of the police investigation, but also we get the official ground for closing. And as we've seen in the majority of the cases, big majority of the cases, the cases is closed because the police failed to either find any suspect at all, and then they close it under the ground of offender unknown, or they failed to collect enough evidence to file an indictment, and then they close it under insufficient evidence. So these two grounds we in Yesh Din mark as a failure in the investigation, because they could not actually crack the case and file an indictment. In those two grounds, there is no argument that the crime was committed. There is no argument on that. Just the fact that they cannot find who did it, the suspect, or they could not gather enough evidence. So that's why we consider those cases as a failure of the investigation. Another, I think, interesting data in our data sheet is the fact that it really changes who the victim is. So as we've seen, we got also all the data we talked about so far is from Yesh Din sample, from Yesh Din cases that we monitor. But we also ask the police to provide data every year. And we got data this year that suggests that there is a difference between how they investigate when the victim of the offense is Palestinian versus cases where the victim is a non-Israeli, meaning that he is either an activist, but mostly a member of the security forces, the Israeli military security forces. So let's say, for example, a settler who attacked a policeman. So those would be the non-Palestinian cases. And the difference is kind of amazing, because we see that there is a higher chance, in 2.5 higher chance to get the file, to get an indictment when the victim is a non-Palestinian. So that we kind of see as the data itself, we see it as a matter of kind of a proof that it's not a matter of ability, but it's a matter of will. So the police has the tools, has the ability to investigate more seriously, but they just don't want to. And this goes, I think Yesh Din has been saying that for many, many years, because as we said, it's not something that is new to this government or this current regime in Israel. It's been going on. Settler violence phenomena is a very old phenomena in Israel. And this is, we call it the commander's spirit. Basically, it comes from high up, from the governments, the different governments in Israel, the tendency to address the settlers as good people, maybe the new Zionists, the people who are the new pioneers who look to, they're kind of serving Israeli interests. So they don't take them as seriously as they should, and they definitely do not mark them as criminals. And therefore, they don't investigate properly whenever there is a complaint about them, and they don't make a lot of effort. We've been seeing in investigation cases that we get, sometimes the only investigative material in the case is the complaint itself and nothing more, which means that the police didn't even bother to do one investigative step. And I think when we talk about settler violence, and sometimes in Israel and also internationally, this is addressed as price tag maybe. So it gets a lot of attention in the spikes periods. And then we have police officers and politicians who talks about how difficult it is to address this phenomena and how complicated it is. But I want to say, mostly we are not talking about the most sophisticated criminals. This is not organized crime. This is not a mafia. And if Israel would have really wanted to address this phenomena and to put an end to it, it would have been successful. The problem is the motivation, not the abilities.
Right. And I, it's a tricky conversation to have about that. This is a long-term problem, but to also recognize the moment we're in with the government that we have right now and how truly extraordinary it is to have, Ben Gvir in power of Israeli police who have openly lauded and threatened to shoot, Palestinians, and with absolutely zero fear of accountability or any indictment. And of course, now with making it easier for Israeli citizens to obtain guns and this huge spike in gun permitting that has happened over the past 2 weeks, even, it's the climate feels to not only permit, but to instruct even violence against Palestinians, particularly in this battle over Area C that you described before. So I don't know if you want to add to kind of this current climate.
Maybe say just that if we thought that there is a near impunity so far for settlers regarding settler violence, this is for sure is going to increase under Ben Gvir's authority. First of all, he got a lot of authority. It's much more wide and expanded than any of his predecessors on the job. So we are really worried that as someone who can actually dictate the investigations policy to the police, he would order them not to investigate or to give it a less of a priority with everything that has to do with settler violence. Which means a full impunity for violent settlers. And yeah, we are worried of what's going to happen in the West Bank. We feel that it's already shown because the atmosphere is Ben Gvir is here, and now we can do kind of whatever we want. In a more maybe personal note, I'm really worried about our staff. Actually, we have field researchers in the West Bank. We have the volunteers of Yesh Din who are also joining our field researchers, and we are really worried for their safety now as well, because no one knows what will happen once the violence is so, I would say, upfront and maybe allowed even.
Yeah, and we haven't even talked about the violence of IDF and the soldiers and the.
This is a subject for another podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there is no good way to wrap up this conversation and to put a happy note on it. But I just would ask I always try to end on what material actions can we take, or where is I cringe to use the word hope, but knowing that the Israeli police are the only avenue for Palestinians locally on the ground to submit their complaints and try to find restitution, justice, whatever it is. But that is such an ineffective place and, or avenue to go. And the words of a Palestinian journalist, Saeed Erekat, who works here in DC, and he relentlessly attends U.S. State Department briefings and regularly asks the questions, where do Palestinians go? Where do they go to seek justice and to seek, even just accountability for crimes? Where do they go? They go to the police, or they don't, and there's nothing offered there. So what is the bigger picture here? What's the call Yesh Din has put out? I know Yesh Din has not been scared to call what's happening in the West Bank apartheid. So what are the levers of accountability that need to be involved here to stop this violence, to afford any measure of protection to Palestinians?
So first of all, I would say that if I had a very good answer, maybe this whole problem would be resolved already. But I do think that there is a responsibility and should be an accountability also for the international community. And this is the occupation is not a closed matter between Israelis and Palestinians. It is an international matter. And the international community has the obligation to put an end to it and to help Israel or force Israel, depends on how you look at it, to do whatever it takes to end this. And as you said, Yesh Din has published a few years ago a report, which is a legal opinion analyzing the legal situation in the West Bank, determining that the crime of apartheid is being committed by Israel in the West Bank. I don't think you can take only settler violence and pin it on that, but if you look at the bigger picture, and as we described before, how this is and we just talked about several components of the occupation, but all put together, this is a system and a systematic policies and practice that are aimed by Israel to basically control not only over the land, but also over the people of the West Bank, Palestinians, and to, I would say, cement and preserve the Israeli control over Palestinians, and also to preserve the superiority of Israelis over and the inferior status of Palestinians, which are kind of the components of the crime of apartheid if you look at the definition, the legal definition. So this is why we got to this conclusion, and we feel that from this conclusion, it also, if you accept this conclusion, it also kind of puts the obligation on the international community to act accordingly. So they are legal institutes, international institutes, and legal tools that can be used in order to have Israel accountable for its actions.
Right. Well,
I really want to maybe end in a more
great. Thank you. Yes.
Optimistic note. No, I'm trying to think what can it be.
I know, right?
No, I think we are going to a very difficult situation, I guess, reality in the coming, I hope not very long years with this new government. But if we need to find a way to look at it in a more positive way, I would say there is a shift in the Israeli public. We see a lot of people on the street. Of course, they're not going to the streets to protest occupation, the Israeli occupation, but I think they are going through a process which is kind of an eye-opening process that can lead them also to see what Israel is doing, not only the Israeli government, not only within Israel, but also in the West Bank, especially since the new government is taking this to the very edge. The talks about annexation, the turning Israel into one state, which is an apartheid state. I don't think it's well with a lot of the Israelis, even those who doesn't care so much about the Palestinians. They do care about what Israel looks like and whether Israel is a democracy or not. And that can be an opening for, I hope, more protests and even maybe stopping the government from doing and implementing its plans. So
yeah,
that might be an optimistic way to look at it.
Yeah, and it also opens the door for me to praise and thank Yesh Din and the rest of the organizations in the ecosystem that continue to document what's actually happening on the ground, so that the facts can be forefront in describing what's happening there, and that it's not doesn't happen in silence, that we can continue to shine a spotlight on what Palestinians are suffering, the dynamics in the West Bank, and of course Gaza and East Jerusalem. And the work of documenting it is difficult, as you said earlier. It's increasingly risky, but it's so important, and we none of the rest of it would be able to happen. There's no way to mobilize or convince people without documenting the facts. So thank you so much for the work you do and for leading a team of field researchers and volunteers that go to these places, that speak with Palestinians, that I mean, obviously your field researchers are Palestinian, that document these things because it's necessary, and it's we as FMEP are so proud to support it. So thank you.
Thank you for having me and for taking an interest in these issues. Not everyone does, so thank you.
Yeah. Incredibly important. We look forward to having you back in future installments of this podcast. So
Thanks.
thank you. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to this episode. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, fmep.org, along with the resource page for this podcast, where I'm going to include a video recording, the audio recording, of course. Ziv's bio will be there, along with a list of resources from Yesh Din, from FMEP, about all the topics that we discussed today for further reading and documentation. Please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast if you're not already. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and also check out our website for upcoming events, including a webinar tomorrow that we're co-hosting with Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, that we're really excited about. It's the second in a series of webinars of learning and unlearning Palestine, and how to be an ally, and how to show up and think and talk about these topics. So with that, thanks again, Ziv. I'm Kristin McCarthy, signing off on this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Take care.